The smell came first, sharp, sour, metallic, like a lightning strike caught in a bottle. It drifted up from the basement of the Cleveland Clinic just after morning rounds on a warm day in May 1929, faint enough to make a nurse wrinkle her nose, but not enough to ring an alarm. In those rooms above Euclid Avenue, patients dozed, doctors scribbled notes, receptionists straightened piles of appointment cards. In the X-ray department downstairs, a clerk turned the key to a storage room and found the air thicker than it should have been, the kind that snatches breath and won't give it back. He stepped in anyway. That's where the film was kept. Shelves of stiff, translucent sheets curled in paper envelopes, each one a fragile portrait of bones and lungs and lives. Cellulose nitrate X-ray film had built an empire of diagnosis, but it had a secret nobody respected enough. It decayed into its own fire. Heat started the chemistry rolling. Time pushed it along. In that little room below the clinic, the kind of room every hospital had, stacks pressed on stacks next to a steam pipe and a bulb that never seemed to cool. The first sign wasn't a spark, it was a hiss, the sound of a material turning into gas and pressure and panic. Then came a pop and a puff of brown. Within minutes, the film began to decompose in earnest, releasing clouds of nitrogen dioxide, a heavy, reddish fume that slithered across the floor and climbed the stairs as though pulled by a string. Upstairs, a receptionist coughed and looked around to see who was smoking. Down the corridor, a patient asked for water. Someone cracked a window and found the air outside easier, sweeter. Another nurse started for the switchboard to summon help, but the board was already lighting up. Calls from the basement, words clipped and ragged. Smoke, trouble, can't breathe. When she lifted the handset, the sting in her throat made her voice sound far away to herself. A doctor in a white coat opened a stairwell door and was punched by a wall of brown gas, his eyes suddenly leaking, his lungs buckling like punched paper. He slammed it shut, turned, and shouted for everyone to move. The building didn't roar, it exhaled. Nitrogen dioxide rolled down corridors and climbed elevator shafts, turning visibility to tea-colored soup and stealing consciousness the way a tide steals footprints. Firemen would later say the flames weren't the enemy, the fumes were. People fell where they stood, clerks with pencils in their hands, patients halfway out of beds, a visitor still wearing a hat. In some rooms, the gas pooled at the floor like an invisible flood. In others, it hung at chest level, so those who crawled lived and those who ran didn't. The lucky ones reached windows and kicked them open to lean into the cool. Others woke on the grass after strangers carried them outside by their armpits, blinking at the sudden sky with the innocence of newborns. On Euclid Avenue, passers-by watched a brown banner seep from the clinic's eaves and drift along the brick like a bruise spreading. The first engines clanged into view and men shouldered hoses, but every time a door opened, the gas boiled out and knocked them back, eyes burning, lips numb. Air masks were scarce and primitive. Most crews went in with wet cloths tied over their faces and came out retching. Doctors who had spent careers steadying hands for delicate work began throwing shoulders into doors, dragging bodies to windows, lowering them on sheets. One surgeon, face banded in a towel, eyes bloodshot, counted breaths for a patient he didn't know while a nurse fanned both of them with a chart. Another doctor made 3 trips into a corridor that had begun to shimmer, carrying 2 people each time until he sat down on the steps and could not be convinced to rise again. The gas had carved him hollow. Inside the basement, the fire found voice. A dull boom lifted dust from rafters and burped flame up a dumbwaiter shaft, igniting papers stacked like winter kindling. The blast rattled glass for blocks and turned hallway clocks askew, but it was brief, more the byproduct of chemistry than the beginning of a grand blaze. That was the horror of it. The building itself would not be a ruin of char, it would be a ruin of breath. When the flames settled, the gas just kept being itself, brown, heavy, eager to take up space where lungs hoped to work. Ambulances shrieked to and from the scene. Private cars became ambulances too. Chauffeurs and stenographers and store clerks ferried the limp and the coughing to nearby hospitals that had not yet learned to fear the brown fog. In some of those receiving rooms, doctors pulled open shirts and found no burns, only bodies crumpled by unseen acid. Treatments were improvised, oxygen tents, steam inhalations, drips of tea, even milk. Some revived, sat up, and asked what had happened. Others seemed to improve and then didn't. Nitrogen dioxide does its damage in layers, and the next layer came hours later, lungs filling with liquid, the wet crackle of edema rising like floodwater. Patients who had walked out on their own feet collapsed at home and were brought back on stretchers in the evening. Numbers began to harden into names. The city morgue overflowed. A temporary hall was pressed into service, tables lined end to end and draped in sheets. Clergy moved along the rows, their voices small against the white tile. Families shuffled in with handkerchiefs over their mouths, clutching descriptions of shoes and rings, trying not to look at faces when faces were unavoidable. The newspapers printed the same headline with different verbs: clinic disaster, clinic tragedy, clinic horror. In the next day's light, the count settled into a figure the city would not forget: 123 dead. Patients, visitors, nurses, clerks, and firefighters, most of them taken by gas, not flame. Behind the public grief was the forensic one. Inspectors traced the path to that basement room, where shelves once stiff with film were dribbled into black jelly. Samples went to laboratories, reports piled in careful script. The verdict was as cold as chemistry gets: nitrocellulose X-ray film, stored in quantity, warmed by the building's guts and its own decay, had produced the nitrogen oxides that became poison the moment they met human lungs. Cellulose nitrate had long been famous for burning like a terrible candle in movie theaters and projection booths. Hospitals had been slower to fear it. Now fear arrived, and it wore lab coats. The reckoning moved at the speed of regulation, which is to say unevenly, and then all at once. Fire chiefs demanded proper masks and got them. Architects redrew plans so that storage rooms for volatile materials lived in fire-resistant alcoves with ventilation that didn't turn stairwells into chimneys. Hospital administrators wrote policies for film retention and destruction, no longer letting mountains of old images grow in darkness until they learned to hiss. National codes were updated. The industry that had birthed the danger pivoted, accelerating the shift to safety film made of cellulose acetate, less flammable, less of a chemistry experiment waiting to happen. A nurse at a smaller hospital, reading the coverage by a single bulb late one night, went downstairs with a key and found her own X-ray closet, hot and crowded. She didn't sleep until it was emptied. At the Cleveland Clinic, grief became ritual. Funerals braided through funerals, black coats brushing the same pews day after day. Dr. George Kreil and his partners, men who had dreamed up a new kind of group practice less than a decade earlier, stood graveside more than once with their hats in their hands. Surviving nurses returned to the building with eyes that watered at the memory even when the air was clean. Patients who had been carried out by strangers sent letters in block handwriting, promising to breathe deeper for as long as life allowed. The clinic reopened rooms as they could be made safe. Families of the dead opened doorways at home onto permanent absence. Memory turned stubborn. In the decades that followed, safety courses would hold up the 1929 clinic disaster as a hinge, before and after. In fire academies, recruits learned to fear brown smoke as something worse than honest flame. In hospital basements, clerks adopted new habits: rotate stock, vent the room, keep the bulb cool, shred what you don't need. Engineers rerouted pipes. Inspectors asked different questions. On paper, these were technical matters. In practice, they were acts of respect for 123 people who had come to a place of healing and met invisible chemistry instead. If you stand outside the modern complex today, with its glass and steel and murmuring HVAC, it's hard to imagine the world of shelves and envelopes and hot bulbs buried below. The city is louder now. The sirens come from farther away. But wind still works the corners of buildings, and people inside still trust walls to keep bad air out. That trust exists because a room once filled with gas until a whole city learned to be suspicious of closets. The old clinic fire did not take the building to the ground. It did something stranger. It left a structure standing and burned a hole through complacency instead. Road to ruin is rarely a single mistake. It's a routine left unchallenged until physics collects its due. In 1929, hospital workers did what they had done every day: filed film, flipped a switch, shut a door against the noise upstairs. The lesson is the shape of the air afterward. Materials have memories. Heat has opinions. Closets deserve as much attention as operating rooms. It took a brown fog and 123 funerals to write those rules in ink that will not fade. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.